Okay, so last time we went through some kind of introduction of the web API part. So we do introduce about like what's the web API, what's the RESTful API. Okay, some definitions, some terminologies, and we also introduced one struct called URL last time, and it has a commonly used initializer, which takes a string. Okay, but the thing is, one thing you need to keep in mind is it returns a optional. Okay, the return type is optional of URL, so you have to do some error checking, error handling on that in case the string you're passing in is not really a valid URL. Okay. Now let's take a look at another thing called URL session. So the URL session is a class defined in the standard library, in the core foundation library. And it provides an API for downloading data from and uploading data to the endpoints indicated by a URL. Okay? And it's from the official documentation. It's kind of the official definition for the URL session. Okay? And you can also take a look at the document from here. Okay? Now, take a look at the code example. Let's see how we actually can use the URL and URL session to actually initiate a web API request. Okay? So first thing you're going to do here, again, we take an example of the endpoint we used before, which kind of returns some fun fact about cats. Okay? And you first need to create a URL by doing something like this. Okay? And I also did the type annotation here. So you can see the URL is an optional of URL class, URL struct. Okay? And of course, you have to do some error handling. In this case, I do the if-let binding, okay, to unwrap the optional data. Okay? So we have the valid URL, which in this case is not an optional anymore. Okay? It's a URL. Okay? And we can call this URL session.shared.data, which is, so the shell is a singleton defined in the standard library. Okay? And you can call that. You can get a singleton out by call .shared. Okay? And it has a function named .data, which can initiate the URL, the web API session. Sorry, web API request. Okay? And it takes an URL. Now, this .data function can throw. Okay, so you have to mark it as try when you actually call that function. And you also see this keyword await here. Okay, so don't worry about that one yet. We will get to that. And so I clear about the general syntax here. Or maybe, and also there's one thing here. We use parentheses to kind of enclose two different types. It's called tuple unwrap, I believe. So the .data function returns two variables, okay, as a tuple. And we can use this syntax to unwrap this tuple. Okay, so it has two elements. Okay, first one is the data, and second one is response. Okay, and you have to do the do try catch block. Well, in this case, I just use try. Okay, so I'd have to do the do and catch statement here. Okay, and also you can print the arrow in the catch branch. Okay, so you can see this. There is a special variable named as arrow. Okay, again, it's created by Swift and inject into your environment. Okay, you don't have to declare that variable. It's here. Okay, in the catch branch, you can just print that out. Okay, is that clear? All right, now let's take a closer look at the data the .data function returns. Okay, it returns two things. First is data, and the type is the data with capitalized D. Okay, and the data actually contains the full information of the payload you get back from the endpoint when you actually access endpoints. And it's in the form of a byte array. Well, it's not exactly byte array, but well, it's some sort of form of byte array. Okay? And later we will pass the data, this variable, okay? And to get the information from that variable. Now, the second element returned in that tuple is called response. The type of that is URL response. Okay? And it contains full information of the header response returned from the API call. Okay, we can use this variable to do some kind of preliminary error checking. For example, we can check the response code. So for example, if it's 200, it means, well, we have a good action, okay? The action actually happens, okay? If it returns maybe 404, well, there might be some error here, okay? Now, let's take a look at how we can parse, it's parse. We can parse the data, use the data and parse it to the string, okay, to a string. So the string struct has another initializer which can take two arguments. First argument is the data, okay. The second argument it takes is encoding, okay. But like usually you go with the default UTF-8, but it's about text encoding. Okay, so we kind of skip that part about the text encoding here. But if you are interested in that, you can go online, okay, and search some information about the text encoding. But usually, you go default one is UTF-8. And this initializer again gonna return an optional, okay, the optional string. Okay, so you have to do the error checking and unwrapping on that. And you can print the result. In this case, it's just gonna return something like that, okay? This is kind of the payload you saw before in the browser, okay, when you access the URL. Okay, is that clear? So far, so good. Okay, now, so we have the data, and in the previous slides, we do parse that to a string, right? But the thing is, we don't just want a string. Actually, we want an object, okay? Now, how we actually can parse the data to an object. And in this case, we do create a struct before, which named as cat_fact. Okay? So how we do that? So I took these two structs, which defined before. Okay? Still remember that? These two things? Yeah, the first one is status, and the second one is cat_fact. Okay, these two structs I defined before in the previous slides. And this is the API call. The web API request we initiate, okay, with the try await thing. Okay. Now let's take a look at this one. There is something called JSON decoder in the Swift. Okay. The purpose of that is decoding some data. Well, essentially, it should be some data in JSON format, okay, and convert that to an object or several objects, like an array of objects, okay. In this case, the decoder, we can instantiate the JSON decoder in this syntax, and it has a function named as .decode. And the .decode takes two things. First one is a kind of actually, it takes a protocol. But anyway, in this case, you can just take a look at the syntax. Basically say cat_fact.self, okay? And it says the second argument is the data. So essentially, it parses the data into an object, which is, well, a cat_fact struct, okay? And again, this decode function can throw things, okay? So you have to do some error checking with try. Okay? Is that clear? So far, so good. And you can see the result we get here. I did type annotation here. It's cat_fact. It's an instance of the cat_fact struct. Okay? Now the thing is, it won't work. Okay? The compiler gonna give you some error. It says instance method blah 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 requires the cat_fact conforms to decodable. Okay, so the issue here is, even though you tell the Swift to decode or parse the data, okay, to the cat fact struct. The thing is, the Swift still don't know how to actually map the JSON string, okay, the JSON fields, to the struct, okay? But you can achieve that easily. Take a look at this thing, okay? We conform both struct, the status struct and cat fact struct, to a protocol named as decodable. And that's it, actually. So it kind of silenced the warning, okay? Now, take a closer look at the decodable protocol. So it looks like some magic, right? So you conform to decodable and it works. However, it's not magic. So first thing I have to mention is, as long as all fields in a struct or class already conforms to the decodable protocol, you don't need to do anything special. Okay, you don't need to do anything additionally. Okay, so in this case, you can see, or actually you can infer that the Boolean, well, for example, like the Boolean, the integer, the string, okay, they are actually already conformed to a decodable, which is implemented by the standard library. Okay. And that's why when you just say the cat fact conforms to decodable, or the status struct conforms to decodable, and it works, okay? That's the reason. So, as I mentioned before, there are also lots of built-in type, for example, string time zone, unsigned int, which is called uint, URL, UUID, integer, float, double Boolean, and more, okay? They are kind of already conformed to a decodable protocol, which is implemented in the standard library, so you can use that easily, okay? And you can take a look at the URL below to see the full list of what kind of type already conforms to decodable. Actually, I can show you right now. All right, so when you're trying to go through the document, for example, in this case, I want to see what kind of other classes or other structs that conform to this one in the standard library, okay? I can go to the button, actually not the button, yeah. Let me see, yeah, this is the list, okay? You can go to a section that says conforming types, okay? And all these types listed in that section is a type which is already conformed to that protocol, okay? That's how you look at the document. Now, so you may also ask like, so what happens if we have some customer struct, which, well, it's not possible to conform to decodable like automatically. So you have to implement this thing, this initializer, okay, for that struct, okay. But we're gonna skip that part, okay. So you basically have to input another additional initializer to tell the Swift how to actually decode these things. Okay, so just give you some concept of that. Okay, now let's actually move to today's topic. So, first thing we're going to discuss, like why we actually need the async await thing. Okay, as you may see in the previous slides, we have some keyword like await. Okay. When we apply a await keyword before some function, that function actually is an async function, okay? And today we're gonna just briefly talk about like why we need these things, okay? In the Swift world, or like in general in programming, okay? And basically a teaser for the async await concurrency model, and we will go to the detail next week, okay? And also we're gonna create the image gallery view, which is the well, if you have checked the reference app, you can see we have the inspiration view, okay? And you can pull up different quotes, which is gonna be your last assignment. And today we're gonna display all different images, okay? And we call that as image gallery view, okay? Now, before we actually get into the async await, there are some notes, okay? So first, when your app starts, okay, the system will create one. Actually, it's not 100% accurate. So system actually gonna create this multiple threads. But for your app, you can only see one thread, okay, which is usually called as main thread, Okay, and that thread is used for your app to run its code. Okay, so for your app, all the thing is happening on the main thread. Okay, just one thread. Okay, and all your updates and rendering happens in the main thread. Okay, and all the codes you've been written so far or seen in this class actually are being run in the one single thread, which is the main thread. Okay, and actually all user interactions such as gestures when you tap on something, okay, or when you drag something, when you scroll the scroll view, okay, that thing actually registered and received and processed in the main thread. Okay, all these things are happening in the one single thread. Okay, and that's the default thread, which is also called main thread. Now let's take a look at an example here. So for example, we have this main thread in this case. Okay, is that visible to you guys? So there's a kind of bluish bar. So let's assume it's our main thread for our app. Okay, so now, for example, we have a new task to do for the main thread. So we just start our app. We just, user on your phone, click on your app. The first thing you're gonna do is render the content view, right? Or in our case, we also call that group view, which is kind of entry point of our app. Okay, so trying to render this thing. So this is the first task the main thread gonna do. Okay, now when user click on the inspiration view, okay, you're gonna try to render the inspiration view. Okay, now when we pull up the inspiration view, what are we supposed to do? Okay, just imagine, just assume we are in the image gallery view to display all different images, okay, from some web API. So our code is gonna initiate some web API requests, okay, and trying to load the image from the remote server, okay. However, this process is gonna take a lot of time, at least, compared to all this internal logic happening behind the thing, okay, because web API request usually takes quite some time, okay. Now, for example, when user just randomly click on the inspiration view and open up the inspiration view, okay, and maybe before you actually finish all the loading process, user just trying to, dismiss that view. So user can trigger some tap gesture, okay, maybe trying to close that view, okay. So what happened? The main thread is still waiting for that web API request, okay, so it's kind of blocked. So at that time, when user trying to maybe close that view or trying to scroll, okay, your UI is frozen, okay, it can freeze your UI, okay, so that's a problem, okay, when everything is running in the main thread or in the one single thread, okay. Now, let's imagine we have some function which called async functions, okay. So when we have async function, again, this time, user open up the inspiration view, okay, and the inspiration view gonna initiate some web API request. But this time, we have a async version of loading images, okay, initiating web API requests. In this case, this function gonna be run on some other background thread, okay? So it won't block the main thread. So right now, for example, user, again, click on something or maybe trying to dismiss the inspiration view, it's still registered, okay, and received and processed in the main thread, and your UI is gonna be responsive in that case, okay? And now, what if you have finished loading all the images, okay? You want to actually display all these images in your UI, okay? So that task should be moved back to the main thread, okay? Should be moved back to the main thread, and this time you're gonna update your UI, okay? And there's one key thing have to keep in mind is everything that involves updating UI should happen in the main thread. Okay? If the UI updating thing happen in some background thread, it's gonna be some, well, it's undefined behavior. It might be some error, it might be some warning, but it's undefined behavior. Okay? So it can be a little bit, it can cause a lot of trouble. So in this case, you have to update your UI in the main thread. And later we're gonna show you how to do these things. Okay? So this animation, this illustration is just some high-level conceptual introduction to how async await kind of works behind the scene. But the thing is, actually, async await is a kind of, they are way more complex than this thing. Okay, so this scenario does 100% reflect the actual case happening behind the thing. Okay, so we'll get to that next week to talk about the concurrency model. Now, there are still a few more comments on the keywords and syntax when you are using the async await functions. Okay? So for example, I have some function to implement. And the signature looks like that. For example, we have the one function, the first function named as get editorial images. Okay? And if we want to define this function as an async function, we have to mark that with the async keyword. Okay, and the keyword go after the parameter parenthesis, but before the return type. Okay, is that clear? And when you define a async function, and you want to call that function, call any async function, you have to put the await keyword before that function when you call that function. Okay. Any questions so far? Anything? Oh, good. Okay. Now, we're gonna jump to the demo, live code demo, to see how we actually add files to create our image gallery view. Okay, and we're gonna majorly working on four files. So first file we're gonna work on is a model. Okay, we're gonna still again strictly follow the MVVM design pattern. Okay, so we're gonna create our model, create our view model, and create our view. Okay, so first thing we're gonna work on is a model, which is a data structure to representing the kind of the image or the struct we fetched from the remote server. Okay, and the second thing we're gonna create something called service. Okay. And the file name gonna be image gallery, so API service. And in that file, we're gonna define some static function. And that function gonna initiate some UL, some web API request, okay? And load the data, parse the data, okay? And for the view model, for the view model and view, you already know the kind of definition, okay? Is that clear? Any question on the view model and the view thing? So what kind of job are they gonna do? Is that clear? Okay. Now, let's jump to the API we're gonna use today to fetch all the images. Okay. So today we're gonna use the Unsplash image APIs. Okay. And Unsplash is kind of the image provider to provide lots of image. And that's kind of neat. So let's take a look at the UI output here. Okay, so this is the developer page for the Unsplash official website. Okay, and for the Unsplash, it's kind of well-organized API, and you have to register a account and apply for the usage of their API. Okay, but for your assignments, you're just gonna directly access the endpoint. Okay, so you don't need all this process. But in this case, I already registered the account, and to apply to be able to use them. Where's my? Give me a second. here we go, to use them, not this one. Okay, to use them APIs, okay? And I already opened up some document, okay, for that API I'm gonna use, okay? So when you're working on some web API things, you're gonna rely on some third-party libraries, okay, third-party services, third-party platform. So you have to go to the documentation and to see what kind of thing you're gonna do and what are some requirements and instructions you have to follow, okay? Now, in this case, for example, this is official documentation for the Unsplash API, okay? And for example, here, you can see it says the API is available at this URL. Actually, I can zoom. Okay, so this is basically the base URL, the endpoint we're going to use, okay? So different website, different web API service have different documentation styles. So you have to, take a look at that, okay? And also, one thing I have to mention is for the Unsplash API, we'll scroll down. You have to you can see it requires an authorization. Okay, so you're gonna say when you actually want to initiate some web API request to us, okay, you're gonna have to pass this something called client ID. Okay, just follow the instruction. Okay, and actually I already have the client ID when I apply for their account. Okay, so I'm gonna show you guys later. Okay, so this is the kind of format you should go with when you initiate some URL request, okay? Now, today, and actually this is the access key and secret key I have, okay? But, well, I mean, when you actually do your own app, don't leak these things, okay? Keep them confidential, okay? Now, today, let me first show you guys two API endpoints we're gonna use, okay? First thing is called photos, okay? And you can see the description here, okay? It basically returns some editorial feeds or images from the API, okay? And the next API we're gonna use is just generate some random images, okay? These are two APIs we're gonna use, okay? Now, the first thing we're gonna do, still remember, we're gonna create the model, okay? And recall from the last lecture when we talk about the mapping between JSON and the Swift object. So what kind of thing you're gonna do when you're trying to, create your model? Anyone? Come on. Yeah. Yeah, go through the API document. Actually, you have to check the payload, okay? You check the payload, so you check the JSON format which can be returned from the API, okay? And you create a struct, okay? That is kind of similar to that struct, to that structure in the JSON format payload, okay? And usually that kind of payload can be listed on their official document. In this case, for example, in this editorial feed endpoint, we can scroll down and you can see there is some example, okay? There are some possible return payload here, okay? And actually, I haven't gone to too detail about this JSON format, but usually when you see a curly bracket, it means that stands for a kind of object, okay? And when you see some, square bracket, it means it's kind of like array, okay? It contains multiple objects, okay? In this case, let's focus on the curly brackets here. So this is the image object, image gallery object we're gonna use, okay? We're gonna map. And the API actually returns multiple images, okay? So is that clear? How to kind of reason about the JSON format. Okay, now let's put things side by side. Oops, still too big. Nah, anyway. So let's go back to this thing, okay? And in our Xcode project, okay, we're gonna open up, actually we're gonna create a new file, new Swift file, named as imagegallery.swift, which is gonna be our model, okay? So I already have that file in this case, okay? So we're gonna create a struct, okay, and name it as image gallery, okay? Now, in this case, we're just gonna use two things, okay? First one is the ID, okay? Use the ID provided from the remote server, okay? And second thing is the, let me see, this should be URL. Here we go. This is URL, okay? And all this URL is the URL to the image we want to use, okay? So you can see the Unsplash API actually provides kind of all different image with different size, okay? So we can fetch different image with different size, okay? And all these other fields, we don't ignore them, okay? If you want to use them, you can put that into your struct if you want, okay? But in this case, we're just gonna ignore them, okay? So now we have to map two fields, okay? First field is named as ID, okay? And you can take a look at the example. You can see the type should be a string, okay? Now the next thing we're gonna focus on is the URLs, okay? And you can see the URL again is a nested kind of object, okay? So it starts with the curly bracket, okay? So we're gonna create as before we did with the struct status. So recall that? So we're gonna create another struct named as URLs, okay? And this time we have several fields. First is row and full and the regular, which is basically mapping all these fields in the document. Okay, regular and small and okay, and their type is string. Okay, so this is some kind of syntax you can use to save you some typing. Okay, just separate all different variables with comma. Okay. Now in this image gallery, again, we're gonna use this URL struct. You can see let name as, let's see, name should be the URLs. Okay, and the type gonna be URLs. Okay, is that clear? Like why we have to do things like that? Why we have to create a struct in this case? Any question? Okay. Now, so what's the next thing we're gonna do? So later we're gonna try to decode the JSON to this struct, but it will have some problems. So what kind of protocol we're gonna conform in this case? Come on, we just went through that. Yep, we're gonna go with a decodable protocol. Okay, so the URL should also conform to the decodable protocol. Okay. And also later we're gonna loop through the image gallery thing. So I just conform the struct to identifiable. And in this case, you can see we don't need to provide the implementation for the ID anymore because we already have the ID. And if you still recall from the previous lecture when we talked about the stable and unstable ID, and in this case you can see the ID is a stable ID because it provides from the remote server, and usually it don't change. Okay. Is that clear so far? Oh, good, right? Now, after we finish the model, okay, actually let me show you something more before we go beyond this thing. So this image gallery stands for each individual image we return from the remote server, okay? And we're gonna use an array of image gallery a lot of times, okay, in the following codes. Okay, so you're gonna see this thing like the array of image gallery a lot of times. Okay, and you can actually save you some typing by doing some type alias. Okay, so for example, I can say type alias images equals to this one. Okay, it essentially means this images. Okay, it's a type, and the type is gonna be essentially equivalent to this one. Okay, you just create a type alias as the name suggested. Okay, so they are exactly the same thing. Okay, now let's move to the next topic, is how to create a service. Okay, now I already have the folder named as service, and I create a file, okay, with some template here. It's named as image gallery API service. Okay, it's a class. Okay, and I already had defined the endpoint, which is as the document listed. This is going to be the endpoint we're going to access. Okay, and it also has a field as client ID, and this ID is the ID I obtained from the developer portal. Okay, when I apply for their the usage, API usage. Okay, is that clear why we need these two things? I mean, the document states we have to use the client ID, and we follow the instructions. Right? And I created two computer variable, and a static computer variable in this case. And let me make it full screen. And you can see these two URL is essentially, well, is equivalent to this thing, for example. Okay, you fetch all the editorial feeds, okay, according to the document. Okay, is that clear? And this one is gonna fetch some random images from the API. Okay, again, it's kind of according to the document. I do these things. Okay, you have to always refer to the document. Okay, and you can see also I use the queries here. Okay, and when I go back to the document, I can see, well, the document say I can provide a count. Okay, and I can specify how many images I want to get from the remote server. Okay, is that clear? Okay, now let's define these functions. Okay, so we can have two functions. First is called get editorial images. Okay, essentially return some images from this endpoint. Okay, and the second function is going to be just get some random images. Okay, and they both call another function called fetch results. It's kind of generic functions to return to fetch data from a endpoint and return the images. Okay, is that clear so far? Okay, now actually implement these things. So we actually just gonna implement this thing. Okay, fetch result. Okay, in this function we're gonna initiate the web API request and get the data, do some error handling, parse the data, and return all the images. Okay, and are you guys clear about this type annotation here? So we just define a type alias for the images, which stands for an array of image gallery. Okay, and it returns an optional. Okay, now let's finish up this function. So first thing we're gonna do is to get a URL. Okay, so the endpoint I passed in is a string. Okay, I have to get a URL. So I say URL with the string initializer, and I'm gonna pass in the endpoint. Okay, is that clear? Now the thing is, it returns a optional. Okay, so I have to do some error checking, and in this case, I'm gonna do a garlet unwrapping. Okay, still remember the garlet syntax. Okay, so what if this URL is kind of maybe returns a nil, means this string passing is not really a valid URL. Okay, so you're gonna do the else branch and say just gonna print some error, maybe say invalid URL. That's it. Okay, and I'm gonna return nil. Okay, that's it. So this is first step we're gonna do with the error handling. Okay, the next thing is we're gonna call the await function on the URL session. Okay, we call URL session.shell.data. Okay, and we put the URL into that one. Okay, you can fetch back the data back. Okay, and you have to mark that with the try. And in this case, I'm gonna demonstrate how to use this try question mark thing. Okay, so when you execute successfully, it's gonna return the data. If it's not, like throw some exception, it's gonna return a nil. Okay, and in this case, I'm just gonna again use the gar let and unwrap these two things with data and response. Okay, and take a look at these things. Is that clear how syntax work in this way? So if this one throws some exception, okay, this one gonna be nil, okay, and they're gonna go into this branch to do some error handling. Otherwise, you're gonna bind this to tuple, to data and response. Okay. Now, in this case, maybe I can just print some other error message. Just say maybe failed to get images, whatever. And again, I'm gonna return nil. Okay. Now, let me show you how to do some preliminary error checking by checking the status code returned from the API. Okay. So the first thing is, again, I'm gonna use gar let, okay, and I'm gonna declare a variable said HTTP response. Yep, here we go, and we have this response, right? But this response is a type of URL response, okay, and we're gonna do some trick like this to convert that to the HTTP URL response. So the as keyword here is a new thing, okay? It basically do some implicit type conversion, okay? So I treat this thing as an HTTP URL response, okay? And this question mark followed by the as essentially means if the conversion doesn't happen correctly, I'm just gonna give a nil, okay? That's why we need to use the gar let in this case. Okay, and the as keyword usually used on some type of conversion when you're trying to upcast or downcast things. Are you guys familiar with upcast or downcast? It's kind of polymorphism thing regarding the, the inheritance. Okay, it's about object-oriented programming. Okay, and in this case, I'm gonna chain the gar let. Okay, again, this is a new thing. Okay, I can chain the gar let statement with a comma. Okay, so in this case, I can say this one, the HTTP response variable, this variable I just got, it has a status code. Okay, so if it's 200, it means, okay, well, it's good, right? So nothing bad happened, okay? So otherwise, so if any of this statement here, well, goes wrong, you're just gonna fall back to this else branch. Okay, and I can print some error, but in this case, that's just gonna return nil. Okay. Now so finally we can try to parse the data. Okay, so I just type this thing out because we are running out of time. So we have JSON encoder. Okay, and to decode this data we just get before. Okay, and we're gonna decode it to a images.self. Okay, this image represents the array of image gallery. Okay, now, so if nothing bad is happening, okay, so I'm just gonna return that thing. Otherwise, if I catch some error, I'm just gonna print the error in this way. Okay, and eventually, if something goes wrong, I'm just gonna return nil. Okay, otherwise, I'm gonna return early. Okay, is that clear so far? Okay, now let's move back to the next thing is our view model. Again, I have some code here. So this is our view model named as image gallery view model. Okay, and conforms to the observable object. Okay, and then we're gonna have two published fields. First is editorial images, and second one is random images. And their type is images, which is again an array of image gallery. Okay, is that clear? All right, now let's finish these two these two functions. First one is load editorial images, and the second one is load random images. And in both functions, we're gonna call that API service. We just create in our, what's that called? The image gallery API service class. Okay, and all these functions that we're gonna call is a static function. Okay, so now we're gonna call the function from the, let me see, image gallery API service and say get the editorial image. In this case, we're gonna mark it with await because this one is an async function. Okay, so when we call that, we have to mark that as await. Okay, is that clear? And it returns something. Okay, it returns an images. Well, an option of images. Okay, so we can again use the guard let. So results, for example. So if that one returns nil, it means something goes wrong. Okay. In this case, I just do nothing, just return. Okay. So otherwise, we're gonna have a valid results. Okay. And if we have valid results, what are we gonna do? Okay. We're gonna assign this valid results to our editorial images. Okay. Again, they are exactly the same type. So the results, it returns images, okay, an array of image gallery. Is that clear so far? Let's see what's going on. Garlet else. Okay, let's grab else. Here we go. Is that clear right now? Well, again, you can do something similar here when you load the random images. Okay. So there are actually some other checking you can do. So for each async function, actually it can be canceled. Okay, it can be canceled, but we're gonna talk about the cancel thing later. But you can do some checking. For example, if the task is canceled, okay, I can just return. I just do nothing. Of course, you can also do this thing. So like before we assign this thing, okay. So if task is not canceled, we're gonna actually, well, do the assignments, okay? But the thing is, when you actually run this code, well, you're gonna give you some runtime warning, runtime error, because this assignment, okay, should happen in the main thread. Why is that? Because you assign this result to the editorial image, and the editorial image is a published variable, which you're gonna use that to display all the image in your view, okay? So you have to move this block of function, this line, to the main thread, okay, to make sure it runs in the main thread, okay? How you can do that? Again, we're gonna introduce a new thing. It's called main actor, okay? And it has a function called run, okay? It takes a closure. I can remove this thing. I can put this thing into this one, okay? And the main actor is the new concept in the Swift from the last year. But right now, you can conceptually think that as some sort of main thread. They are not exactly the same thing, but well, for now, you can think that as a main thread. So by doing that, I can put this line to make sure it runs in the main thread. Okay? Is that clear right now? Okay. Now let's see. Actually, let's move to the. Let's see, move to our view. Okay, we have our view model, and let's move to view. Where's our view? View, image gallery view. Okay, so I just skip the introduction of this view. This scaling code I have is basically have a stated object to have our view model, and you already do that lots of times. Okay, and we just finished the function for the editorial feeds. Okay, and in this case, I'm gonna load or call the function from the view model, okay, when this image, when this view appears, okay, and you already know that there's one view modifier named as dot onAppear, right? Well, the thing is, when we call a async function here, we're gonna use something different, okay, and it's called task, okay. And the task takes some code, okay? And again, I'm gonna call, so first we have the view model here, okay? So we're gonna call the view model dot load editorial images. In this case, I have to put the await before that, okay? So this task is actually quite similar to the onAppear, okay? It also happens when the view appears on the screen, okay? But the thing is, you are calling the async function. Okay, you have to use this dot task. Okay, Is that clear? Okay, so next lecture, I'm gonna finish up this thing to actually show you guys how to use the async image. But for the rest of your last assignment, I believe you don't need that part of concepts. You already know how to initiate the URL request, okay? So you should be able to finish your last one after this class, I believe. Hope so. But anyway, we're gonna go over this next Tuesday. Okay, any question? Anything? All right. Now, see you guys next week.